woman sits still in a 19th century photographic studio. Her dress is dark, her face is calm, and behind her, barely visible in the chemical fog of the image, stands someone who shouldn't be there. Not a servant, not a passerby, not a trick of the eye, at least not to the people who paid for these pictures. In the early 1860s, the American photographer William H. Mumler became famous for producing what were called spirit photographs, portraits in which the living appeared beside hazy figures said to be the dead. He was not working on the edge of folklore. He was working at the very center of modernity, in an age when photography was beginning to seem almost mechanical in its honesty, as if the camera itself could not lie. And yet, here it was, apparently capturing ghosts. That alone would be strange enough. But Mumler's images were only the beginning, because across the 19th century, something unsettling kept happening. A boy appeared in Germany with no clear past, and Europe could not decide whether he was a victim, an imposter, or something even more dangerous. In Britain, a man surrounded by contradiction convinced thousands that he was a lost aristocrat. In New York, a newspaper persuaded readers that life had been discovered on the moon. A giant was dug from the earth. Machines were seen in the sky before such machines should have existed. Again and again, impossible things did not merely circulate as rumors. They arrived with portraits, headlines, witnesses, legal testimony, displays, artifacts. They arrived looking documented. So what was really happening here? Was the 19th century simply full of hoaxes, frauds, and gullible crowds? Or did modern society create something more disturbing? A new world in which the unbelievable could look real precisely because it had been photographed, printed, exhibited, and repeated. Tonight, we are not just investigating a series of historical oddities. We are investigating the moment when reality itself became harder to recognize. Before we can understand why so many strange stories seemed believable in the 19th century, we need to step back and look at the world that produced them. Because the century in which these mysteries appeared was also the century in which information itself changed shape. At the beginning of the 1800s, most people still experienced news the way humans had for centuries, slowly, locally, and often through word of mouth. A rumor might circulate through a town. A traveler might bring a story from another city. A pamphlet might spread an idea among a few hundred readers. But by the middle of the century, something very different had begun to emerge. New printing technologies dramatically lowered the cost of newspapers. Railways and telegraph lines accelerated the speed of communication. Urban populations grew larger and more connected, and suddenly information could move faster and reach farther than ever before. A story printed in one city could appear in another within days, sometimes within hours. This was the birth of what historians often call mass media culture. In cities like New York, London, and Paris, newspapers were no longer elite publications aimed at a small literate class. They became cheap, widely circulated, and fiercely competitive. Editors learned quickly that attention was valuable, and that attention often followed the unusual. A strange discovery, a mysterious crime, a scientific breakthrough, or something that merely looked like one. The line between verified knowledge and sensational reporting was not always clear. And at the same time, another powerful technology was entering public life: photography. When the first photographs appeared in the 1830s and 1840s, they seemed almost miraculous. Unlike paintings or engravings, photographs appeared to capture the world directly. Light itself etched the image onto a surface. For many people, this made photographs feel almost objective. If the camera showed something, surely it must have been there. But early photography was also technically fragile. Long exposures, double exposures, glass plates, chemical fogging, and studio manipulation could easily create images that were ambiguous, distorted, or misleading. A faint second exposure could make a transparent figure appear behind a sitter. A movement during the long exposure could blur a face into something ghostly, and to a modern viewer, these artifacts may look suspicious. To people encountering photography for the first time, they could feel mysterious, even supernatural. And photography was only one part of a larger visual culture that was rapidly expanding. Illustrated newspapers began publishing detailed engravings of distant events. Exhibitions and traveling shows displayed unusual artifacts to paying crowds. Courtroom trials became public spectacles reported in newspapers across entire nations. In this environment, seeing something, whether in print, in a photograph, or on display, carried enormous persuasive power. A strange object in a glass case could attract thousands of visitors. A story repeated in newspaper columns could acquire authority simply through circulation. A photograph could appear to confirm what had once been only rumor. And this created a new historical condition. For the first time, a society existed in which belief could spread at the speed of media, not the speed of direct experience. Stories no longer had to remain local. They could become national, even international. And once a story entered this system, once it had images, witnesses, headlines, and debates, it could take on a life of its own. Sometimes the story was true. Sometimes it was exaggerated. Sometimes it was entirely invented. But the structure that carried the story forward was the same. And within this new structure, a series of events began to appear that felt strangely unstable. Events where evidence existed, where witnesses spoke, where objects could be seen. And yet something about the story never quite settled. One of the earliest and most haunting of these stories began in the German city of Nuremberg. It began with a boy who seemed to arrive from nowhere, a boy who claimed he had spent most of his life in darkness, and whose identity would become one of the most enduring mysteries of the 19th century. On the afternoon of May 26, 1828, a strange scene unfolded in the streets of Nuremberg, a historic city in the German state of Bavaria. A teenage boy wandered into the city square. His clothes were simple and worn. His walk was stiff and uncertain, as if he were not used to moving freely. And when people tried to speak with him, something became immediately clear. The boy could barely talk. He repeated only a few phrases. One of them sounded like a request. "I want to be a cavalryman, like my father." He carried a letter addressed to a cavalry captain in the city. The letter claimed the boy had been raised in secrecy and was now being sent into the world. But when officials began questioning him, the story became stranger. The boy said he had spent most of his life locked in a small, dark room. He claimed he had rarely seen another human being. He said he had slept on straw. He said someone had occasionally brought him bread and water. And he said he had learned to walk only shortly before being released. The authorities did not know what to make of him. At first, many suspected a hoax. But the boy's behavior was difficult to fake. He seemed overwhelmed by basic sensory experiences. Bright sunlight hurt his eyes. He struggled to stand upright for long periods. He reacted strongly to sounds and smells that most people barely noticed. Within weeks, the boy became a curiosity across the region. His name, he said, was Kaspar Hauser. Local officials placed him under observation. Teachers attempted to educate him. Doctors examined him. And slowly, piece by piece, his story began to circulate through the German states and beyond. Newspapers reported the case. Travelers came to see him. Intellectuals debated what he represented. Was he a victim of a crime? Was he mentally impaired? Was he inventing a story? Or was something else happening entirely? Some observers believed Kaspar Hauser was telling the truth, that he had indeed grown up in isolation, hidden away for reasons no one understood. Others suspected a performance. But as the months passed, a more dramatic theory began to emerge. A theory that transformed the boy from a curiosity into a potential political mystery. Some people began to wonder whether Kaspar Hauser might not simply be a victim of neglect. They wondered whether he might be someone important, someone whose identity had been hidden, someone who had been deliberately removed from public life. In particular, rumors began circulating that he might be connected to the House of Baden, a German noble family whose succession had long been complicated by intrigue and tragedy. The theory was explosive. It suggested that Kaspar Hauser might be a missing royal heir, secretly imprisoned as a child and replaced to prevent him from inheriting power. No definitive proof ever emerged. But the rumor alone transformed the case. Now Kaspar Hauser was no longer just a mysterious boy. He was a figure at the center of a possible dynastic conspiracy. Interest in him intensified. He was taken in by several patrons who attempted to educate him and protect him. Among them was the English nobleman Lord Stanhope, who briefly supported the young man before later expressing doubts about his story. Observers studied Kaspar closely. They noted his unusual sensitivity to light, his difficulty with ordinary movement, his sometimes childlike behavior. Some saw these traits as evidence of prolonged isolation. Others interpreted them differently, but the uncertainty only deepened the fascination, because every attempt to explain Kaspar Hauser seemed to create new contradictions. If he were a fraud, why had no one exposed him clearly? If he were telling the truth, who had imprisoned him, and why? The mystery might have slowly faded with time. But in 1829, something happened that changed the story again. Kaspar Hauser was attacked. An unknown assailant struck him in the forehead. He survived the incident, but the attack intensified the sense that powerful forces might be involved. Then, 4 years later, in December 1833, the story took its darkest turn. Kaspar Hauser was found in a garden in the town of Ansbach, seriously wounded by a stab wound to the chest. Before dying a few days later, he claimed that a stranger had attacked him and given him a purse containing a cryptic note. Investigators examined the scene. But almost immediately, the case fractured into competing interpretations. Some believed Hauser had been murdered to silence him. Others suspected something else. They believed the wound might have been self-inflicted, either intentionally or accidentally, during a staged encounter that went wrong. The official investigation never reached a definitive conclusion, and so the story of Kaspar Hauser ended much as it had begun, with uncertainty. Was he a victim of one of the most disturbing crimes of the century? A young man hidden away for political reasons, and then eliminated once he became too visible? Or had Europe been captivated by an elaborate deception? Even today, historians remain divided. But for our story, Kaspar Hauser matters for another reason. Because his case reveals something unusual about the 19th century. In earlier centuries, a mysterious stranger might have remained a local curiosity, but Kaspar Hauser did not remain local. His story spread through newspapers, pamphlets, and intellectual circles across Europe. His portrait circulated. Debates about his identity appeared in print. Doctors, teachers, nobles, and journalists all attempted to interpret the evidence. And yet, despite all this attention, despite all this documentation, the truth about him never fully settled. The more the story was recorded, discussed, and analyzed, the more uncertain it seemed to become. And Kaspar Hauser would not be the last person in the 19th century to experience that strange condition, because only a few decades later, another figure would appear. Another man whose identity seemed to collapse under scrutiny, except this time, the stage would not be a German city. It would be the entire nation of Britain. And the question would not be whether a mysterious boy had been hidden from the world. The question would be whether a complete stranger could convince thousands of people that he was someone else entirely. If the mystery of Kaspar Hauser showed how identity could remain uncertain even under intense scrutiny, the next case in our story revealed something even stranger. Sometimes identity did not remain uncertain. Sometimes it became believable in spite of contradiction. And nowhere was this more dramatically displayed than in Victorian Britain during one of the most extraordinary legal spectacles of the 19th century. It began with a disappearance. In 1854, a young English aristocrat named Roger Charles Tichborne was traveling in South America. He was the heir to the wealthy Tichborne family, one of the oldest Catholic noble families in England. While returning to Europe, the ship he was traveling on, the Bella, was reported lost at sea. Roger Tichborne was presumed dead. For years, the story seemed to end there. But his mother, Lady Tichborne, refused to accept the loss. She believed her son was still alive. And so she began placing advertisements in newspapers around the world, searching for him. It was an act that might have faded quietly into history, except that more than a decade later, someone answered. In 1866, a man living in Australia came forward, claiming that he was Roger Tichborne. At first glance, the claim seemed implausible. The man was named Arthur Orton, a butcher's son from London who had spent years in Australia. He was large, heavy, and spoke with an accent that sounded nothing like the refined speech expected of an English aristocrat. Yet he insisted he was the missing heir, and astonishingly, Lady Tichborne believed him. Despite his appearance, despite the inconsistencies, despite the doubts raised by many members of the family, she accepted him as her son. And once she did, the story exploded. The claimant, as he came to be known, traveled to England and demanded recognition as the rightful heir to the Tichborne estate. The case quickly became a national sensation. Newspapers reported every detail. Crowds gathered to watch court proceedings. Pamphlets circulated arguing for and against the man's identity. And something remarkable happened. Thousands of ordinary people began to support the claimant, not quietly, not cautiously, but passionately. Many working-class Britons saw the case not just as a family dispute, but as a battle between ordinary people and the aristocracy. If the claimant truly was Roger Tichborne, then the powerful family members opposing him might be suppressing the truth. But even if he was not, the story had taken on a life of its own, and the contradictions were obvious. Roger Tichborne had been slender. The claimant was enormously overweight. Roger spoke fluent French. The claimant barely knew the language. Roger had distinctive tattoos from his travels. The claimant did not. Witness after witness came forward, describing these discrepancies. Yet belief persisted. Part of the reason was psychological. Part of it was political. But a large part of it had to do with something new in the 19th century. Public spectacle through mass media. The Tichborne case unfolded not just in private investigations, but in public trials that lasted for months and were reported in extraordinary detail by newspapers across Britain. Readers followed the testimony day by day. They studied portraits of the claimant. They read witness statements. They debated the evidence. And in doing so, they became participants in the mystery. For the first time, a question of identity was not just decided by a small group of officials or family members. It became a national narrative. The first major trial began in 1871. Lawyers argued over letters, handwriting, memories, and physical features. The proceedings stretched on for months. Eventually, the court ruled against the claimant, but the story did not end. Instead, the man was charged with perjury, leading to a second trial in 1873 that lasted an astonishing 188 days, making it one of the longest trials in English legal history. In the end, the verdict was clear. Arthur Orton, the claimant, was declared an impostor and sentenced to prison. And yet the deeper mystery remained. Because the trial did not erase belief, even after the verdict, many supporters insisted the decision had been wrong. Some believed the aristocracy had manipulated the outcome. Others believed the evidence had been misunderstood. The story lingered in the public imagination long after the legal case ended. And this raises a strange question. Why? Why did so many people continue to believe a claim that seemed increasingly difficult to defend? Why did contradiction not collapse the narrative? One answer lies in the power of the public arena that had emerged in the 19th century. For centuries, identity had largely been something local and personal. People knew who you were because they had known you all your life. But in an age of expanding cities, migration, and global travel, identity became easier to question. And in an age of newspapers, identity could become a story. Once the story began circulating, it acquired its own momentum. Articles repeated earlier claims. Pamphlets defended one side or another. Illustrations and portraits allowed readers to imagine the characters. The debate became something that people could follow almost like a serialized drama, and the longer it continued, the harder it became to close the case. The Tichborne Claimant was not simply a fraud trial. It was one of the earliest examples of a mass-mediated identity crisis. A case in which documents, testimony, portraits, and headlines produced a spectacle so large that the truth struggled to keep up. But even this extraordinary story was only part of the pattern, because the 19th century did not just produce uncertain identities. It also produced entire worlds of information that turned out not to exist at all. In 1835, decades before the Tichborne trial began, a New York newspaper convinced thousands of readers that astronomers had discovered something astonishing. Life. Not on Earth, but on the Moon. And for several days, the story seemed completely real. By the early 1830s, newspapers in cities like New York were becoming something new. They were cheap, they were fast, and they were competing fiercely for attention. This was the age of the penny press, newspapers that cost only a few cents and were printed in huge numbers for a mass audience. Unlike earlier elite publications, these papers depended on selling as many copies as possible, and nothing sold newspapers like a discovery, especially a discovery that changed humanity's understanding of the universe. So when readers of the New York Sun opened their paper in August 1835, they encountered a series of articles that seemed almost unbelievable. According to the report, the famous British astronomer, Sir John Herschel, had made a revolutionary observation using a powerful new telescope in South Africa. He had discovered life on the Moon. The articles described the discovery in extraordinary detail. There were forests on the lunar surface. There were strange animals resembling bison and goats. There were towering crystal structures. And most astonishing of all, there were creatures described as winged humanoids, beings that seemed almost like bat-like people. To modern readers, the story may sound absurd, but to many readers in 1835, it sounded scientific. The articles were written in a tone that mimicked academic reporting. They referenced telescopic technology and observational techniques. They described lunar geography with convincing specificity. And perhaps most importantly, they borrowed the authority of a real scientist. Sir John Herschel was one of the most respected astronomers of the time. His name alone gave the report credibility. For several days, the story spread rapidly. Other newspapers reprinted it. Readers discussed the discovery. Some were skeptical, but many accepted the possibility that science had just revealed an inhabited moon. Only later did it become clear that the story had been entirely fabricated. The author was Richard Adams Locke, a journalist for the New York Sun. The so-called discoveries were not observations, they were inventions. Locke had written the articles as a kind of elaborate satire, partly mocking speculative astronomy and partly exploiting the public appetite for sensational science. But the satire had an unintended consequence. It worked. The story was believed widely enough that it became one of the most famous media hoaxes in American history. Yet the real significance of the Great Moon Hoax is not simply that a newspaper published a false story. False stories had existed long before newspapers. What made this episode remarkable was how believable the story looked. It was structured like scientific reporting. It appeared in a reputable newspaper. It referenced real institutions and real scientists. And once the story entered the information networks of the time, it spread faster than anyone could easily correct it. Readers did not just hear the rumor, they saw it printed, in columns of text that looked authoritative, in descriptions detailed enough to feel observational, in articles that appeared over multiple days, reinforcing the illusion that new evidence was arriving piece by piece. In other words, the story did not simply exist as gossip. It existed as documented reality, and that distinction mattered because documentation changes how humans process belief. A rumor can be dismissed. A printed report feels different. It can be quoted, reprinted, archived, argued over. It becomes part of the historical record, even when it is false. And this is where the pattern in our story begins to sharpen. In the case of Kaspar Hauser, identity remained unstable despite intense documentation. In the case of the Tichborne Claimant, documentation and testimony multiplied, but failed to produce consensus. And in the case of the Great Moon Hoax, documentation created a discovery that had never existed. The pattern suggests something subtle but important. The 19th century was not simply an age when new technologies helped reveal the truth. It was also an age when those same technologies could manufacture credibility. A photograph could make something look real. A courtroom could make an identity claim feel legitimate. A newspaper could make an impossible discovery seem scientific. And once these mechanisms were in motion, belief could spread across entire societies. But newspapers and photographs were not the only forces at work, because by the late 19th century, another kind of spectacle had become enormously popular. The public exhibition. In cities across Europe and the United States, crowds gathered to see unusual artifacts displayed in museums, fairs, and traveling shows. Curiosities from distant lands, ancient fossils, strange natural formations, or objects that appeared to belong to an entirely different chapter of history. But one such object emerged in 1869 from a farm in the small town of Cardiff, New York. Workers digging a well struck something unexpected beneath the soil. A massive stone figure, 10 feet long, shaped unmistakably like a human being. And almost immediately, people began asking a question that sounded like something from myth. Had a giant once walked the earth? In October 1869, workers digging a well on a farm near the small village of Cardiff, New York, struck something solid beneath the soil. At first they assumed it was stone, but as they continued digging, a shape began to emerge. A foot, then a leg, then a torso. Within hours it became clear that the object buried beneath the ground was not just a rock. It was a giant human figure, carved or shaped from stone, nearly 10 feet long. News spread quickly through the surrounding countryside. Neighbors came to see it. Farmers, laborers, and curious travelers gathered around the excavation site. Some believed they were looking at something ancient. Others believed they were witnessing something biblical. Because the 19th century was a time when debates about the ancient past were intensifying, geologists were uncovering fossils that suggested Earth was far older than many religious traditions had assumed. At the same time, certain interpretations of the Bible described a prehistoric age in which giants once lived on Earth. So when people saw the enormous stone figure lying in the ground, the possibility did not seem entirely absurd. Perhaps this was evidence of that forgotten age. The farmer who owned the land, William Stubb Newell, quickly realized that the discovery had commercial potential. He built a tent over the site. Visitors were charged 50 cents to see the giant. Crowds began arriving in remarkable numbers. Within days, thousands of people had traveled to the small New York village to look at the mysterious figure. Newspapers reported the discovery. Scientists and scholars were invited to examine it. And almost immediately, opinions divided. Some experts insisted the giant must be a relatively modern sculpture. Others believed it might be an ancient statue or relic. A few were willing to entertain the possibility that it represented a petrified human body. The debate only increased public interest. People traveled from distant cities. Visitors lined up outside the tent to see the figure lying silently beneath the canvas roof. Soon the site was earning enormous amounts of money. Entrepreneurs took notice. Among them was the famous American showman P.T. Barnum, who offered to buy the giant. When the owners refused to sell, Barnum responded with characteristic flair. He built his own replica and began exhibiting it elsewhere, claiming that his version was the real giant. Now 2 giants were traveling the country, both attracting crowds, both provoking debate, and both generating profit. But beneath the spectacle, another story was slowly emerging. Because the Cardiff Giant was not ancient, it had not been buried for centuries. It had been placed in the ground deliberately. The man behind the hoax was George Hull, a businessman and skeptic who had become frustrated during an argument about biblical giants. To prove a point about human gullibility, Hull secretly commissioned a massive stone statue to be carved in Iowa. The figure was then transported to New York and buried on the farm of his relative William Newell. Nearly a year later, the staged discovery was arranged. Hull's experiment worked almost perfectly. Crowds paid money to see the giant. Experts debated its authenticity. Newspapers reported the mystery. And for weeks, the figure stood at the center of national attention. Eventually, the hoax was exposed. Hull confessed. The Cardiff Giant was revealed to be a carefully constructed deception. But the exposure did not immediately destroy the spectacle. Visitors continued coming. Debates continued. Even after the truth was known, the giant remained fascinating. Because the story of the giant had already taken on a life of its own. The artifact may have been fake, but the event surrounding it was completely real. Thousands of people had seen it. Hundreds of articles had been written about it. Money had changed hands. Arguments had been recorded. In other words, a fictional object had generated a genuine historical moment. And this brings us one step closer to the pattern emerging across the 19th century. A photograph could suggest a ghost. A mysterious boy could generate a European debate over identity. A newspaper could invent life on the moon. And now a carved statue could persuade thousands of people that a giant once existed. In each case, the unbelievable did not spread through rumor alone. It spread through evidence, through photographs, through testimony, through artifacts, through printed reports. The stories looked real because they were documented. But perhaps the strangest example of this phenomenon came near the end of the century, because by the 1890s, something even more extraordinary began appearing in newspapers across the United States. People were reporting strange machines in the sky, long, cigar-shaped craft, moving silently through the night, glowing with bright lights, machines that seemed far more advanced than anything engineers of the time had publicly built. These reports appeared again and again, in city after city, across entire regions of the country, and suddenly the question was no longer whether a single photograph or artifact could mislead people. The question was whether an entire society could begin seeing the same impossible thing at once. By the 1890s, the world was already beginning to imagine flight. Inventors across Europe and the United States were experimenting with balloons, gliders, and early powered machines. Engineers spoke openly about the possibility that controlled flight might soon become a reality. But in the winter of 1896, something strange began appearing in American newspapers. Reports of airships, not balloons drifting in the wind, not experimental gliders, but large, controlled flying machines. They were described as long and cigar-shaped, often carrying powerful lights. Witnesses said they moved deliberately across the sky, sometimes against the wind, sometimes hovering, sometimes traveling at speeds that seemed astonishing for the era. The first widely reported sighting occurred in California. In November 1896, residents of Sacramento reported seeing a bright light moving across the night sky, attached to a dark object that resembled a mechanical craft. Newspapers quickly picked up the story. Soon other cities reported similar sightings: San Francisco, Oakland, Stockton. Then the reports began appearing farther east. Over the following months, newspapers across the United States printed accounts of mysterious airships seen in the sky. Some sightings were brief, a light moving silently across the horizon. Others were detailed. Witnesses described propellers, wings, and cabins. A few accounts went even further. Some claimed that the craft had landed. Some claimed that they had spoken with the pilots. The descriptions varied, but one detail remained consistent. These machines seemed too advanced for the time. In the 1890s, powered flight had not yet been achieved in a practical way. The Wright brothers' famous flight at Kitty Hawk would not occur until 1903. Yet newspapers were filled with reports of aircraft crossing the American sky years earlier. Editors debated possible explanations. Some suggested that a secret inventor had succeeded in building a revolutionary flying machine and was testing it in private. Others suspected elaborate hoaxes. And still others wondered whether witnesses were simply misinterpreting ordinary lights or celestial phenomena. But the reports continued. In 1897, sightings spread through the American Midwest and South. Cities in Illinois, Texas, Kansas, Missouri, and Arkansas reported strange aerial objects. The phenomenon became known as the mystery airship wave. Thousands of readers encountered these reports. Some believed them, some laughed at them, some debated them seriously. But once again, the pattern repeated. The phenomenon didn't remain a local rumor. It became a national story. Newspapers published sketches of the mysterious craft. Editors reprinted reports from other cities. Witness statements appeared in columns and headlines, and the more the reports circulated, the more real the phenomenon seemed. One article would describe a sighting. Another paper would confirm that people in another city had seen the same thing. A third article would speculate about the identity of the mysterious inventor. Each new report strengthened the sense that something extraordinary might actually be happening. Yet historians looking back on the event today face the same puzzle. What exactly were people seeing? There are many possible explanations. Some sightings may have been misidentified astronomical objects, such as Venus appearing unusually bright near the horizon. Some may have been weather balloons or experimental craft. Some reports were clearly fabricated, humorous or sensational pieces written by journalists themselves. And others may have been genuine misinterpretations, shaped by the excitement of a society already dreaming about the coming age of flight. But what makes the mystery airship wave fascinating is not just the question of what was in the sky. It is the way the phenomenon spread. Through newspapers, through shared stories, through repeated descriptions. Each new account made the previous ones feel more credible, and gradually a possibility emerged in the public imagination. Perhaps someone had secretly built a machine capable of controlled flight years before the Wright brothers. Whether that possibility was true or not, it shows how powerful the machinery of belief had become. By the end of the 19th century, an entire society could participate in constructing a phenomenon. Not through conspiracy, not necessarily through deception, but through the interaction of observation, expectation, and media circulation. And if we step back and look at the stories we have followed so far, something remarkable begins to appear. A ghost in a photograph, a boy with no clear past, a man claiming to be someone else, a scientific discovery that never happened, a giant dug from the ground, machines seen in the sky before they should have existed. Each story is different. Each has its own explanation, its own debates, its own historical context, but together they reveal something deeper. Because in every case, the strange thing did not spread simply as rumor. It spread through evidence, through photographs, through newspapers, through witnesses, through artifacts, through public debate. And that leads us to the final question of this investigation. Was the 19th century really an age filled with strange events? Or was it the first age in which modern society learned how to make the unbelievable look convincingly real? Why the 19th century produced so many believable mysteries? At this point in the story, we have seen a pattern begin to emerge. A photograph appears to show the dead. A boy appears without a clear past. A stranger convinces thousands he is someone else. A newspaper invents life on the moon. A giant is unearthed from the ground. Flying machines are reported in the sky before powered flight officially exists. Each case is strange on its own, but taken together, they suggest something larger. The question is, why? Why did so many stories in the 19th century take on this peculiar quality, appearing believable even when the truth remained uncertain? Historians generally do not look for a single explanation. Instead, several overlapping forces help illuminate what was happening. 1. The rise of mass media. The first explanation lies in the transformation of communication. By the mid-19th century, newspapers had become powerful engines of public attention. Cheap printing technologies allowed papers to reach vast audiences. Railways carried newspapers across entire regions. Telegraph networks allowed news to travel at unprecedented speed. This meant that a story could spread quickly and widely, but it also meant that once a story entered the press, it could gain credibility through repetition. Readers encountered the same story in multiple publications. Editors quoted one another. Reports were summarized, condensed, and reprinted. And as this happened, the story began to feel more substantial, even when its origins were uncertain. The Great Moon Hoax of 1835 is a perfect example. The articles were fictional, but because they appeared in a widely read newspaper, and because other papers reprinted them, the story acquired a strange aura of authority. It looked like knowledge, even though it was not. 2. New technologies of evidence. The second explanation involves the rise of technologies that seemed to produce objective truth. Photography was one of the most powerful of these technologies. Unlike paintings, photographs were created by a mechanical process. Light itself produced the image. To many people, this meant photographs were inherently trustworthy. But early photographic techniques were vulnerable to manipulation. Double exposures, glass plate artifacts, and staged compositions could produce images that were ambiguous or misleading. William Mumler's spirit photographs appeared during precisely this moment, when the public had begun to trust photography deeply, but had not yet developed widespread skepticism about how images could be altered. The result was a paradox. The more authoritative a technology seemed, the more convincing its illusions could become. 3. A changing sense of identity. Another factor shaping these mysteries was the transformation of identity in the modern world. In earlier societies, identity was usually local and stable. People were known through family networks, community memory, and lifelong familiarity. But the 19th century brought enormous mobility. Industrialization drew people into rapidly growing cities. Migration carried individuals across continents. Travel became easier. In this environment, identity became easier to question. The case of the Tichborne Claimant reveals how dramatically identity could become unstable once it entered the arena of mass media. The man claiming to be Roger Tichborne faced overwhelming contradictions. And yet the debate did not remain a private matter. It unfolded in public trials reported daily by newspapers. The result was something new. Identity itself became a public narrative. And once that narrative existed, belief could persist even when evidence conflicted. 4. A culture of spectacle. The 19th century was also an age of exhibitions, fairs, and public curiosities. Museums displayed ancient artifacts. Traveling shows presented unusual objects and performers. Entrepreneurs discovered that the strange and the mysterious could attract enormous crowds. The Cardiff Giant emerged directly from this environment. It was not simply a hoax, it was a spectacle. People traveled long distances to see it. They paid admission. They debated its meaning. Even after the deception was revealed, the giant continued to attract attention because the spectacle itself had become the real event. 5. The power of expectation. Finally, there is the influence of imagination. By the late 19th century, the public was already anticipating the technologies of the future. Inventors were experimenting with flight. Scientific discoveries were expanding humanity's understanding of the universe. People expected dramatic breakthroughs. So when reports appeared describing mysterious airships in the sky, the idea did not seem entirely impossible. It felt like the future arriving early. In many cases, witnesses may have misinterpreted lights, balloons, or ordinary phenomena. But expectation shaped perception. People saw what they believed might soon exist, and once those sightings were printed in newspapers, they became part of the historical record. None of these explanations alone can fully account for the pattern we have seen. Mass media helped stories spread. Technology gave them the appearance of evidence. changing identities created new forms of uncertainty. Public spectacles encouraged fascination with the unusual, and cultural expectations shaped what people thought they were witnessing. Together, these forces created a new historical environment, an environment in which belief could travel faster than verification. And in such an environment, the unbelievable could sometimes appear almost perfectly real. But this leads us to an even deeper question. If the 19th century produced a new world of photographs, newspapers, witnesses, and artifacts, did it also produce a new kind of historical mystery? One where the problem was no longer a lack of evidence, but too much evidence of the wrong kind. In other words, not a world without proof, but a world where proof itself had become unstable. What the historical record actually shows. At this point, it is tempting to step back and assume that the stories we have explored are simply a collection of colorful historical curiosities. A ghost photograph here, a mistaken identity there, a sensational newspaper hoax somewhere else. But when historians return to the archives, to the actual documents, reports, and images produced at the time, something more complicated appears. Because these events were not isolated anecdotes remembered only in folklore, they left behind remarkably detailed historical traces, and those traces help us understand both how the stories spread and why they were so persuasive. Newspapers, the engine of circulation. One of the most important sources for understanding these mysteries is the newspaper archive. Throughout the 19th century, newspapers served as the primary medium through which stories moved from local incidents to national conversations. Take the Great Moon Hoax of 1835. The original articles were published in the New York Sun, but they did not remain there. Other newspapers across the United States and Europe reprinted the reports, often without verification. Readers encountered the story repeatedly in different publications, and repetition can create an illusion of confirmation. When multiple papers carry the same report, it can feel less like rumor and more like established fact. This dynamic did not require malicious intent. In many cases, editors simply assumed that a story printed elsewhere had already been checked. The result was a feedback loop. A claim printed once could quickly appear many times, and each repetition strengthened its apparent credibility. Photographs, evidence that could mislead. Photography introduced a second layer of complexity. Today we are accustomed to questioning images. We know photographs can be manipulated. But in the mid-19th century, photography was widely perceived as a direct imprint of reality. That perception gave images extraordinary persuasive power. Spirit photographs like those produced by William Mumler exploited this cultural trust. Even when skeptics suggested technical explanations, such as double exposures or reused photographic plates, believers could still point to the image itself. After all, they could see it. And seeing has always carried enormous psychological weight. Photographs do not merely describe events, they appear to witness them, which is why debates over the authenticity of these images became so intense. The image seemed to prove something. The only question was what? Court records. Identity under public examination. The Tichborne trials reveal another type of historical evidence. Legal testimony. Court records from the trials contain thousands of pages of statements, cross-examinations, and arguments. Witnesses described Roger Tichborne's habits, handwriting, education, and appearance. Lawyers compared memories, documents, and physical traits, and yet the enormous volume of evidence did not produce immediate clarity. Instead, the evidence itself became the subject of debate. different observers interpreted the same testimony in different ways. Some saw confirmation, others saw contradiction. The historical archive preserves all of these voices, but the archive does not automatically resolve the disagreement. Personal accounts and memoirs. In addition to newspapers and official documents, many of these events generated personal reflections. Observers wrote letters, witnesses recorded memoirs, travelers described what they had seen or heard. These sources add texture to the historical record. They reveal how ordinary people experienced these mysteries as they unfolded. For example, letters from visitors who saw the Cardiff Giant describe both fascination and doubt. Some visitors were convinced they were looking at something ancient. Others suspected a trick, but still paid to see the spectacle. In this sense, the artifact mattered less than the experience of encountering it. The problem of retrospective interpretation. Another challenge emerges when historians look back from the present. Modern readers already know the outcomes of many of these stories. We know the Cardiff Giant was a hoax. We know the moon discovery was fictional. We know Arthur Orton was declared an imposter. But people living through these events didn't have that certainty. They encountered the stories in fragments, a newspaper article here, a rumor there, a witness account days later. Information arrived slowly and unevenly, which meant that uncertainty could persist for long periods, and in that uncertainty, speculation flourished. Comparison across cases. When historians compare these different events, certain similarities appear again and again. First, each story involves some form of evidence: a photograph, a letter, a physical artifact, a witness statement, a printed report. Second, the evidence circulates widely, through newspapers, through public exhibitions, through courtroom debates, through repeated retellings. Third, the evidence proves difficult to interpret. The same photograph can suggest multiple explanations. The same testimony can support opposing conclusions. The same artifact can be seen as ancient, fraudulent, or misunderstood. This pattern reveals something subtle about the historical record. Evidence does not automatically settle a mystery. Sometimes it multiplies the possible interpretations, and when that happens, the story itself can grow larger than the facts that produced it. A new kind of historical landscape. By the late 19th century, the world had entered a new informational landscape. Images circulated faster than before. Stories reached larger audiences. Artifacts could be displayed to thousands of visitors, and legal disputes could unfold in front of an entire nation. The result was a historical environment in which belief, doubt, and documentation existed side by side. Mysteries no longer required the absence of evidence. Sometimes they emerged from the presence of too much evidence, evidence that pointed in different directions, and this environment produced stories that still feel strangely modern. Stories in which the question is not simply what happened, but what people thought was happening. And that realization brings us to the final step of our investigation. Because if these mysteries were not just random events, if they were symptoms of a deeper transformation, then the 19th century may represent something more than an era of strange stories. It may represent the beginning of a new relationship between truth, evidence, and belief. If we step back from the individual stories we have explored, something remarkable begins to appear. Each event looked mysterious in its own way. A photograph seemed to reveal a ghost. A boy appeared without a past. A man convinced thousands that he was someone else. A newspaper described life on the moon. A giant emerged from the ground. Machines were seen in the sky before modern aviation officially existed. At first glance, these stories seem unrelated. Different countries, different decades, different circumstances. But they all share something surprisingly similar. In every case, people were not simply reacting to rumors. They were reacting to evidence, a photograph, a document, a courtroom testimony, a newspaper article, a physical artifact. Something that appeared to prove that the strange event had really happened. And that is what makes these stories so revealing about the 19th century. Because the century that produced these mysteries was also the century that produced the modern system of proof. Before this era, most knowledge traveled slowly. Stories spread through conversation, through letters, through local memory. Verification was limited by distance and time. When a strange story appeared, it often remained confined to the place where it began. But the world of the 19th century was changing rapidly. Railways connected cities. Telegraph cables carried messages across continents. Printing presses produced millions of pages every day. Photographic cameras began capturing moments that seemed permanently preserved. And together, these technologies created something new. For the first time in human history, evidence itself could travel quickly. Images, testimonies, and artifacts could circulate far beyond the communities where they originated. But this transformation created a strange paradox. Because the faster evidence traveled, the harder it sometimes became to verify. A photograph could be reproduced in newspapers across an entire country before anyone carefully examined how it had been made. A sensational discovery could be printed in dozens of newspapers before scientists had the chance to investigate it. A courtroom trial could turn into a national spectacle long before the facts were settled. In other words, the systems that allowed societies to document reality were also capable of spreading misinterpretations of reality. And this did not require deliberate deception. Often the process unfolded naturally. A witness described something unusual. A journalist reported the story. Another newspaper reprinted the report. Readers discussed it. New witnesses stepped forward. And slowly, the event took on a life of its own. Once that process began, the mystery became larger than the original incident. The story became a shared cultural experience, and that experience could persist even after the explanation emerged. The Cardiff Giant was revealed as a hoax, but the crowds who saw it had still participated in a genuine historical moment. The Great Moon Hoax was fictional, but the excitement it generated revealed how powerfully scientific language could shape belief. The mystery airship wave may have been a mixture of misidentifications, jokes, and speculation, but it demonstrated how an entire society could begin imagining the same technological future at the same time. And this may be the deeper historical meaning behind these stories. The 19th century was not simply an era filled with strange events. It was the moment when humanity first entered a world where information, images, and artifacts could shape belief on a massive scale. A world where the boundary between observation and interpretation became increasingly difficult to see. A world where proof could be persuasive, but not always decisive. And in that sense, the mysteries of the 19th century may feel strangely familiar, because the same questions still surround us today. How reliable is the evidence we see? How quickly do stories spread before they are verified? And how often do images and documents shape our beliefs before we fully understand what they represent? These are not just historical questions. They are modern ones, which means that the strange stories of the 19th century may not belong entirely to the past. They may represent the beginning of a new kind of uncertainty. a world in which evidence itself became part of the mystery. If we return for a moment to the stories that opened this investigation, they begin to look slightly different. A photograph that seemed to capture a ghost, a young man whose past could not be verified, a stranger who convinced thousands he was someone else, a newspaper discovery that placed life on the moon, a stone giant lying beneath the soil, a series of mysterious machines reported in the night sky. Each of these events once appeared to challenge the boundaries of what people thought was possible. But in the end, most of them were not supernatural. They were something more subtle. They were moments when evidence and belief became tangled together. The photograph existed. The artifact existed. The testimony existed. The newspaper article existed. The witnesses existed. Nothing about the events themselves was imaginary. What made them mysterious was the meaning people attached to them. A blurred image became a spirit. A rumor became a discovery. A statue became a fossil. A distant light became a machine from the future. And once these interpretations entered the networks of newspapers, exhibitions, and public debate, they could spread far beyond the original moment that produced them. By the end of the 19th century, humanity had entered a new historical environment. A world filled with images, documents, artifacts, reports. A world in which almost every event could leave a trail of evidence behind. But that evidence did not always settle the story. Sometimes it made the story even more complicated, because evidence can be misunderstood, evidence can be incomplete, evidence can be shaped by expectation, and sometimes evidence can be manufactured. The mysteries of the 19th century reveal the moment when societies first began learning how to navigate this new landscape. A landscape where truth was no longer hidden by the absence of proof, but sometimes obscured by too many competing forms of proof. And that may be why these stories still feel strangely modern, because we live in a world that inherited the same system, a world of photographs, documents, headlines, witness accounts, and endless streams of information that appear to confirm what we think we see. But the deeper question remains. When we look at a piece of evidence, an image, a document, a testimony, are we seeing the truth itself, or are we seeing the interpretation of truth shaped by the technologies and expectations of our time? The 19th century was the moment when that question first became impossible to ignore. And in many ways, we are still living inside the answer.